The role of government should not be to find the top of the Laffer curve. We always want to be on the other side where taxes are distorting people's behavior as little as possible. I feel like the Laffer curve framework feeds people into thinking we just need to find the top, which is totally the backwards way to think about this, in my opinion.
Hello, welcome again to an episode in the Let People Prosper series. My name is Dr. Vance Ginn. I hope you're having a prosperous day. Well, today I'm delighted to have on someone who knows a lot about taxes, not only here in America, but also across the globe. But he also knows a lot about free markets and has worked on this at a think tank within government. And it's just a great person to talk to. It's none other than Michel. Adam, welcome to Let People Prosper show.
Thanks for having me on. I'm excited to be here.
Well, I'm excited to have you on. We've been friends for a while now, and so it's really good to have you on the program. We've got a lot to talk about. So before we get started, let me go ahead and read your bio for the audience, and then we'll jump right into it. So Michel is Director of Tax Policy Studies at the Cato Institute, where he focuses on analyzing the economic and budgetary effects of taxation in the United States. Prior to joining Cato, he served as Deputy Staff Director at the U.S. Congress Joint Economic Committee, where he helped lead Senator Mike Lee's Social Capital Project, organized congressional hearings, and produced research on a wide array of current economic topics. He also worked as Senior Policy Analyst at the Heritage Foundation and as the Program Manager for the Spending and Budget Initiative at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. He is widely published and quoted in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and other places. He has also appeared on Fox News, CNN, and CNBC to discuss tax policy and its effects. He received his PhD in economics from George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia, and a BA in politics from Whitman College in Walla Walla, Washington. So I really should be saying Dr. Michel. Sorry about that, Adam.
That works.
With your background and everything else, I'd like to get an idea of why do you do what you do every day?
Yeah, I think it's a great place to start. I guess at a meta level, when I think about that, it's obviously freedom. I think that everything that we sort of do day to day here at Cato in the policy world is motivated by getting sort of government out of the way and letting people live the life they want to live. Yeah. But if I'm being honest, I think what gets me up in the morning, day to day, is just a love of learning new things. The policy world, especially tax policy, where I do most of my work, touches everything in our lives. Taxes fund sort of all the things the government does, all the things they spend money on. Politicians want to inevitably tax sort of everything or subsidize it through the tax code one way or the other. There's a tax angle. So I get to get up every day and learn something new about how taxes impact the energy sector or personal savings or the rum industry, or you name it. You get to learn something new every day, and it's a blast. And that's, I think, what day to day really gets me excited about the work that we do.
Yeah, that's awesome, Adam. And I think most people wouldn't think about taxes being fun, but the work that you do and what you're looking across, you make it fun. I mean, you have to in order to think about how government is taking money from the private sector and how they're taking it and where it's going and everything else really makes sense because it's influencing all of our lives, right?
Doing your taxes is no fun, but taxes impact our decisions on all of these margins that people don't usually think about. And so I think people underestimate how much the tax code impacts their life.
Yeah. And with your background, when you're at Heritage and you're at the Joint Economic Committee and everything else, what are some of the steps that got you to where you are today? Were you interested in this in high school and college, or was this something that got you interested later on?
I think I came to the policy world through politics. I was always interested in following politics in high school. Did undergrad, and I came to DC, internships in sort of on the Hill and elsewhere around town. And I decided to get a master's degree in economics, and met folks at the Mercatus Center and fell into tax policy simply because I think what the timing at that time, we were getting ready for the 2017 sort of tax reform build up in 2013, 14, sort of big proposals started coming out. And so scholars there were working, Jason Fichtner there was working on these issues. And I sort of came alongside and was able to work with him on a lot of sort of tax topics and sort of fell in love.
Whenever you were looking at all these things, are there certain assumptions that you make about tax policy or economics in general? I mean, I've talked to a lot of folks and they have different views on the economy, right? Whether it be more of Chicago school or Austrian school or public choice. I mean, there's a lot of different types that are out there, but I wonder what kind of drives your thinking and your assumptions from the lessons that you've learned.
Yeah, so I guess I'll at even a higher level than that. Yeah. First, taxes impact people's behavior.
Yeah.
Taxes and fiscal policy impact people's behavior. I think that's where you have to start. Whether you're taxing someone's wages, they're going to work less. If you're raising taxes on business income, you're going to get fewer businesses or less innovation from the business sector. If you're taxing people's savings and investment, you're going to get less investment in the future, which has broader economic ramifications. So that's at a really basic level, sort of where I always start. The sort of second layer to that is, I think, is usually economists sometimes can get too caught up in what works on the blackboard and sort of what the perfect model is, without bringing in the how politics influences what ultimately gets implemented.
Yeah.
Political actors, as you very well know, face all sorts of different constraints that are not in place in the textbook, and so things that might be good ideas in theory are often not as good of an idea in practice, and we need to sort of be comparing imperfect to imperfect rather than imperfect to perfect.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. It reminds me a lot of the work in the public choice economics, right? Where James Buchanan, Gordon Tullock, and others were talking about how, look, politicians are rational. They just have a different set of marginal cost and marginal benefits, because one of those is to get reelected, which doesn't necessarily have all the private sort of cost and benefits that we from the outside would use to make those decisions. And that's where they often run afoul, where they start wanting to give out handouts and picking winners and losers in the tax code and everything else. So I think you're right on there. It's a great way to get things started. When you're looking at a good tax policy, a good tax code, going back to your higher level assumptions and everything else, what would be kind of the ideal tax code to you?
So I think in any sort of tax reform, or as we're thinking about how to improve the tax code, the first thing we should be focused on is how do we remove current distortions that that taxes are causing in people's lives. The most costly distortions for long-term well-being and sort of economic growth are distortions to people's savings and investment decisions. So the income tax system that we currently have, we have a sort of hybrid system, but the income tax base tends to double or triple tax people's savings and investment. It's taxed when you earned as wages. It's taxed again at the corporate level. It's taxed again when you earn a capital gain or dividend. Often taxed again with a estate tax when you die. And so all of those different layers of taxes mean that people and businesses do less activity for the future, less investment in new machines and new things that increase people's productivity. And so that's the ultimate sort of high level goal, should be to reduce those biases against savings and investment. And that's both lowering rates, but things that are maybe a little bit more in the weeds, like full business expensing, letting businesses write off new investments in the year they make them, that help us step by step move in that direction of sort of letting people make the best decision for them, rather than the tax code influencing how much they consume now versus later.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. When you're looking at these things in tax policy, there's a lot of talk about the Laffer curve and the amount of tax revenue that's coming in and what the effects are on economic growth. And if it's 0%, you're not going to bring any income, but if it's 100%, you're not going to get any income because of, there's not going to be economic activity. So there's some rate in the middle there that's going to support the most economic growth, or at least not be as burdensome to economic growth. And some would even go as far as to say, tax cuts pay for themselves. We hear that, right, by some supply side economists, and I'm sympathetic to that. But I also think that we've got to make sure that we have spending restraint whenever you're making those tax cuts as well. I mean, because when we look at these different tax cuts, whether it be from JFK during the 60s, or Reagan during the 80s, or George W. Bush during the 2000s, or Donald Trump during 2017, we saw pretty massive deficits thereafter. And some people will blame that on the tax cuts, rightly or wrongly. And there are incentive effects that take place, right? But at the same time, we didn't see any spending restraints. So what else did we expect? But I wonder, from what you've looked at, Adam, about this, where you're at on, do tax cuts pay for themselves and things of that nature?
Yeah, there's a lot of really great questions in there. I think the Laffer curve is obviously in the extreme true. If you have a 0% tax rate, you're not going to get any revenue. If you tax people at 100%, you're also not going to get any revenue. And the debate is sort of where the top of the curve is I think is often beside the point. The role of government should not be to find the top of the Laffer curve. We always want to be on the other side where taxes are distorting people's behavior as little as possible. So I feel like the Laffer Curve framework feeds people into thinking we just need to find the top, which is totally the backwards way to think about this, in my opinion.
It's like a maximization problem. How can we just maximize that rate when that, how do we know what we're maximizing? What's part of the overall equation we're trying to maximize?
Exactly, and when the taxes are there to fund what the spending the government is doing, and so that side of the equation is just as important. And we can cut taxes as much as we want, but if we don't cut spending, ultimately taxes have to go up, or it's going to be paid for by inflation or some other or cost in some other way to folks. Like nothing is free, and so I think we need to think about the whole picture. And often the tax cuts themselves, when they're not paired with spending reductions, are just distorting the cost to current taxpayers, right? If the cost of government today goes down because I got a tax cut, but I'm getting the same amount of services, maybe I'm going to demand more services in the future. And this, I think, empirically, we see historically that each addition, like when the government raises taxes, we don't actually eliminate the deficit. Instead, they add spending above the amount of taxes that you raise. And that, I think, it gets this political economy point where we can't just assume that like the deficit goes away when we increase taxes, but instead there's many more moving parts that make the analysis a little less straightforward.
Yeah, no, great points there, Adam. I think we probably have to go back to Calvin Coolidge, one of my favorite presidents, who cut or at least kept spending under control and restrained the growth of spending where they were running surpluses. I mean, they were actually paying down the debt during that period of time. And 100 years ago, I wish we learned more of those lessons today, because we'd be in a much better situation. Because now, we have $34 trillion in gross national debt. You and I as taxpayers, we're paying about, $250,000 or somewhere right around there per taxpayer is what we owe on that debt. And then we got to think about unfunded liabilities and Social Security and Medicare and all of that stuff that, hundreds of trillions of dollars we're looking at there. It's a massive problem. And what we hear sometimes, especially by those on the left, is that if we just tax the rich, we could pay off the debt, or we could bring down and balance the budget. But I wonder, with your research on this, is that even possible to tax the rich and be able to balance the budget when we have $1 trillion debt or multiple $1 trillion deficits per year?
It's not. I think we have $2 trillion-ish deficits that are going out into the future. It keeps growing over time. President Biden has this pledge of he's not going to raise taxes on anyone earning over $400,000 a year. And if you were to just confiscate sort of every dollar earned over that threshold, you're still not able to cover sort of projected future deficits, let alone any additional spending that politicians like to call for. And so the reality of paying for big government is that it's really expensive and everyone has to pay for it. If you're going to have a European style welfare state, which is sort of what the United States is headed towards, if we don't already have, you need European style tax systems. And the way they do that is high taxes on the middle class and the working poor. They do this through 20% value-added taxes, which are sales taxes sort of on everything people buy. They have high marginal income tax rates that don't start at the very top of the income distribution, but start in the middle of the income distribution. So that's the reality of how you pay for big government sustainably. And that's it. If we're going to have a big government for the perpetual future, it comes with all sorts of costs, not just the cost of the government taking more of your paycheck, but also economic costs of slower growth and less innovation.
That's unfortunate, but it's true. This is where we're at. I mean, this is something that we've got to face. Rahm Emanuel kind of popularized, don't let a crisis go to waste. And I hope that we don't have to wait until that crisis happens. I think we're almost there, if we're not there already. If we're seeing interest rates go up, we're seeing the Federal Reserve, the balance sheet being $7.6 trillion still. It's coming down some from the $9 trillion, but still it's massive of how much the Fed has printed this money, when we wonder why we have persistent inflation. We have these people saying transitory inflation. It's like, come on, just look at the data of what's going on here. This has been persistent inflation, and we just had new news, for January's inflation, 3.1%. So it's and 3.9% when you look at the core. So some over time, Adam, have said, look, deficits don't matter. I remember when I was in the White House at OMB, I would get people come in and they were saying, look, deficits don't matter. And I'm like, no, they do matter because it changes the dynamics in the economy. You have redistribution effects that will happen. And if you just print the money and inflate it away, then you'll have effects, the Cantillon effects, right? You'll have effects throughout the economy that you may not see, but it's happening. And now what's kind of interesting is that we're seeing the higher interest rates. We're seeing the inflation that's a direct result of these bad policies that have been happening over time. And I wonder how we can capitalize on that, though, Adam, to say, look, here's the effects. It's not just something that's down the road. Here's what we see today. Well, we've got to get control over this. Don't you think?
I mean, you're exactly right. The deficits matter, debt matters, and we've started to see the impact of some of these choices that we've made. I think if I had the answer to that question, how do we get people to care about the size and scope of government? I would be telling everyone every day I could. As deficits continue to climb and inflation is a problem, people are caring more than maybe they did 4 or 5 years ago. For me, the way I try to talk about it is eventually we're going to need to pay for all this government spending. And inflation is one cost, but taxes are another cost. And if you put the cost of what the government is spending in tax dollar terms, like someone earning $40,000 a year in your sort of average EU country pays $6,000 more in taxes than that same person would in the United States. That's the cost to an individual. And you're exactly right. It's a really sticky issue, and getting people to care about it is the first step. Yeah. And to your point about the political economy, I mean, you've got those on the left. The Democrats are basically, they don't really care. They just want to keep spending. I mean, we've seen the massive increase in spending over the last few years under the Biden administration. But of course, Congress passes these bills. But even there are many Republicans I don't know are too big on this, because they're willing to spend a lot more as well, whether it be on the Ukraine stuff that's going on or Israel. And there are different dynamics of whether that's good or bad. I don't necessarily want to go into all of that, but they're not offsetting it, and there's no funding source for these things. So you just keep adding more and more to the national debt, and this can't end well. I mean, when you look at across history, whether it's Greece or other countries, we've seen what this will do. And it's one of my major concerns. I mean, one thing, Adam, I've been saying is that I think the largest national crisis is the excessive government spending, which of course goes to the national debt and everything else, but it kind of infiltrates everything else that we try to do, whether it's with China or trade policy or whatever else that it may be. This debt really influences all of that, right? It is. The debt does, but the spending itself is problematic as well. I think we often leave that part of the discussion aside. Like, I spend a lot of time talking about how taxes distort people's behavior and slow economic growth, and the debt, you're right, has all these sort of impacts and drag on the economy. All of the spending the government is doing is also distorting people's behaviors and crowding out real activity. Some of the work that I did when I was at the Joint Economic Committee working with Senator Lee on the Social Capital Project was how government crowds out social connections and distorts sort of private associations on the ground. We think about the government crowding out private savings or sort of crowding out private investment. The government also crowds out private activity in your sort of social life and your daily life. They distort how people work and their connection to the labor force. There's all these costs that people don't see or don't think about that come from not just the taxes, not just the debt, but also the actual money that's going out the door. Yeah. I hope we can get away from this Keynesian sort of thinking. And some are grabbing hold and going down the modern monetary theory, MMT, ideology. I don't think it's even a theory in economics, but it's more of an ideology that we can just keep, funding things. And all we have to do is raise taxes, and then that will bring down inflation. As it seems like the situation we're in, it's unfortunate. And I'm glad you brought up the work you did at JEC. And I wonder what your experience was like there, working on the Social Capital Project, and Senator Mike Lee, who's done a lot of great work in this area. Were there any other lessons that you took out from that experience? So I was in think tank world at Heritage for a while, and I moved onto the Hill. Worked at the JEC for a couple of years, and it was a phenomenal experience. You learn a lot sort of just being on the Hill and being around sort of where policy decisions or policy conversations at least are happening. JEC sort of covers all economic topics under the sun, so I was able to branch out and work on things other than sort of tax specific policy. And we were there during the height of inflation. So we put together an inflation tracker and made did some, I think, some really cool empirical work on inflation, but also did work on how social bonds have decayed over time and how government distorts those activities. So it was really got to work on a lot of really cool issues that I think pressing today and important to people's lives.
Yeah, definitely. And what about that connection between like the economy? Because most people think about economists like us. They don't really care. They're just econ nerds, and they're looking at these individuals as, something that don't really connect, and there's not this social capital. And I try to get out there. Part of this Let People Prosper show is like civil society is really what we need more of. And the way that you strengthen that is not by more government. In fact, if you're trying to socially engineer people's behavior, you're going to get worse outcomes, which you were kind of mentioning earlier. But I wonder if it had changed some of your mind or maybe solidified some of your assumptions while you were there.
Yeah, I think libertarians in particular often neglect the analysis of the things that are harder to measure, and that's like social connection, trust, family. All of these things it's hard to put numbers to them, and so empirically it's hard to say anything with a whole lot of certainty one way or the other. But we know that these things are foundational and really important. And so shining light on how connections to family and friends and work have declined over time is really important and an important conversation that's often missed when we're talking about GDP and investment and tax policy writ large. And if the goal is to actually reduce the size and scope of government, the things the government is doing in individuals' lives, it has to be replaced by the institutions that used to fulfill those roles. Local community organizations, churches, things that have atrophied over time. And so I think it's important for us to not just invest in scaling back government, but also talk about the importance of revitalizing the rest of those sort of structures that would hopefully can take up some of that slack.
Yeah, no, that's great. And you were doing great work there. I was continuing to read while you were there. And Kevin Corinth was there as well, who's now over at AEI. He's doing some great work there too. We've got a lot of things that are going on right now in the world. and when you're looking at the tax code in particular, there are a lot of things that are expiring next year. And when we're looking toward the future, there's an election this year, presidential election that is. And so that's going to be dynamic, and we'll see what happens, with that and leading to more uncertainty. We've got the Fed.
A dynamic is a nice euphemism.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. We've got the Fed maybe cutting rates this year. I think they're going to keep pushing that back depending on what the inflation does. But this uncertainty also about the tax code. I mean, all the individual tax rates expire. Full expensing, they're trying to get that back on. There's this quote unquote bipartisan tax deal that's been discussed right now of trying to get full expensing, but they're also trying to expand the child tax credit, which I don't like that part of the idea. And I wish we could go down a different route with this, maybe wait until after the election's over before they push that too much. But I do like full expensing. I think that's important. And so I wonder, like in your analysis, how big a threat is this? Because the other thing is, if all these do expire, some would argue, well, this could help with the debt. It can help with the deficit, because if we extend them all, then this is also going to influence CBO's projections. We just said we're going to add $20 trillion in debt over the next decade, which of course they always use like rosy assumptions, and that includes no recessions and everything else. And so I wonder, like, how big of an issue is this going into the next couple of years?
Yeah, it's the big thing that Congress is going to have to deal with in 2025. The 2017 tax cuts are almost all temporary. Almost all of the pieces fully expire in 2025, 2026, everything other than the corporate rate cut. And your CBO assumes that all of the taxes go up by $400 billion a year after 2025, starting in 2026. And so the current CBO deficit projections are rosy to the extent that Congress actually wants to keep taxes from going up to such a degree on basically every single American. There's this narrative out there on the left that the 2017 tax cuts were just a tax cut for the rich. That's just simply not the case, and Democrats are going to have to start wrestling with that in the next year or so, that this was a broad-based tax cut for people all up and down the income distribution. It's expensive to extend all these things, but it's also really important for economic growth. That conversation is going to be a challenging one for, I think, people on both sides of the aisle.
I agree. And I think going back to our conversation we've had here is that we've got to do something about the spending. right? Because that's really the main problem here. I mean, even if you look at the percentages of GDP or however you want to look at it, that keeps going up in spending, CBO analysis, whereas tax revenue, it stays pretty flat. And even historically, that's been the case. As you know, I'm a big fan of fiscal rules. I would like a spending limit and really putting something in place that reins in the growth rate of spending. Because even if, I've done some work with Americans for Tax Reform on this, if we had a sustainable budget to where we just limited spending to population plus inflation over the last 20 years, instead of adding $20.2 trillion in national debt, it would have added $700 billion. That's a huge swing in a positive direction for taxpayers, whether it be debt and inflation and everything and higher taxes, and more money in our pockets today for more economic growth. Because ultimately we need more growth and we need spending restraint. I think both of those together will really help us to solve a lot of these debt problems. And I hope you're right. I hope that there is a good discussion over the next year. I'm a little concerned about this fiscal commission. I hope it's not all about raising taxes. We've heard some, but it is important for us to look at that. One last thing here as we're wrapping up is you've done some work on OECD, kind of what's going on and kind of this global tax. There's a lot of discussion, Adam, about we just need a global government, it seems like, is what they're trying to do. And I know you've been pushing back on this. So like, what's up with this? What's going on?
Yeah, there's a whole can of worms in the sort of international tax world. So it can get incredibly complex, but the OECD is basically pushing an international tax cartel. They are trying to eliminate tax competition, at least on tax rates, and raise business taxes on primarily American firms. And I think the political economy of this is basically the United States cut our corporate tax rate in 2017, and sort of the European countries got scared that they actually have to compete with our businesses, and they're trying to claw back a lot of those gains. And the Biden administration is willing partner in that. They propose this two-pillar sort of solution to raise taxes on American businesses and other multinational businesses around the world. And it's a really raw deal for Americans and American taxpayers. And and unfortunately, I think we're sleepwalking into just accepting what the OECD is proposing. And so as you mentioned, I have a bunch of recent writing on trying to get Congress to think about the issue differently rather than adding new rules to our tax code to stop businesses from leaving the United States. I think Congress should be exclusively focused on making the United States the most attractive place to do business in the world. And that's continuing to cut the corporate rate, that's full business expensing, that's moving more towards a territorial tax system. All of these things would make the United States an effective tax haven. And that's playing the game the OECD is trying to stop. And I think that will ultimately sort of break the back of this tax cartel they're trying to set up and be a winning proposition for American workers and the American economy sort of writ large.
Yeah. Well, keep up the fight because we need it. I think it's a terrible idea and that we should not go down that route. And you're right. I think that many people want there to be kind of this level, quote unquote, level playing field across the global economy. But anytime you have kind of a cartel that's forcing prices, in this case, taxes, to be a certain level, they're going to be ones that want to cheat and go underneath it, just like we have with the oil cartels and OPEC and things of that nature, right? And so something like this just doesn't make economic sense for even the European countries. They want to be competitive. Competition brings about the best of us and the best in us. And so I'm hopeful that this will not go through.
The proposal they have isn't going to end competition between countries. It's just going to change the margin on which we compete. And so they'll set a minimum floor of a 15% minimum tax, and instead of being able to compete on tax rates, we've already seen countries are moving to competition on tax subsidies and direct subsidies. I think if we actually go down this road, the OECD is institutionalizing competition over industrial policy rather than the types of sort of tax rate competition that has been beneficial over the last several decades. Yeah. So there's sort of a lot to dislike in this proposal.
Yeah, that's a great point. And just kind of wrapping up here, speaking of industrial policy and everything else, and there's a lot of this on both sides, Republicans and Democrats. Former President Trump has this proposal of a tariff, right, just as a tax on Americans of 10% on pretty much all imports and maybe even 60% on China. What do you think that would do to the country's economy?
Nothing good. Yeah. I think you're right. It's something that will ultimately be passed to Americans, and rates that high could sort of break the global trading system. I don't know. It's hard to sort of fathom what something like that would look like. And it certainly wouldn't help us with our fiscal situation or
No.
make anything easier. I think it's pretty destructive idea.
Yeah, yeah. It reminds me of the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, but contributing to the lead up to the Great Depression and the other factors that were going on. And you're right. I mean, you mentioned this earlier, but as they raise taxes, they just want to spend more of it. And Albert Alessina had some good work on this. That if you want austerity, you don't want to raise taxes because that also reduces economic growth. You really want to focus on spending. And I wouldn't consider Alessina to be a far right economist or anything like that. I think he did some good work before he passed. But I think these are types of things that we need to have these conversations, Adam, and I'm glad that you're continuing to talk about these things and pushing the envelope and doing great research in the process, because without that, it's going to be difficult for us to make any progress. So I appreciate all the work that you're doing, and God bless you and your family.
Thanks. It was a fun conversation.
It was. Well, keep up the good work. For the audience, please give us a 5-star rating, share this with your friends and family so they can understand more about taxes and our fiscal situation and ultimately how to let people prosper. And you can find all the show notes at vanceginn.substack.com. We'll put links and everything else that we've discussed today. So until next time, let people prosper.